1993 was a pretty good year in video games. In fact, if you quizzed anybody who was around gaming at that time, it's very possible that they might have mentioned titles they enjoyed like Doom or Daytona USA or Star Fox or Sonic CD, Mortal Kombat 2, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, Echo the Dolphin, Aladdin. I know some might say Myst, but I would personally say Return to Zork, which is far superior, Samurai Showdown, and etc. Now, of the games that might land on a top 100 of 1993 list, or even a top 200, one you probably won't find on there is one of the two launch games for the Atari Jaguar, which came out in November 1993, called Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy. In fact, among Jaguar games, it's rated number 50 on MobyGames.com, and it's seen as one of the weaker titles in the Jaguar's library, and it is really one of the poorer shoot-em-ups out there. Of course, I can name at least one that is worse, such as Star Fox.
Ah! No.
Fool you!
Now, put down your pitchforks. I'm talking about Star Fox on the Atari 2600 by Mythric, not Nintendo's effort. But if there's any game that could use a complete overhaul and remake, it's Trevor McFur. Now, this all came to mind with the news that JV Games and Songbird Productions is remastering a Jaguar game, Towers 2. Since then, I've been thinking about other games that are deserving of the remaster or remake treatment, and Towers 2 really wasn't at the top of the list or the first game that came to my mind. Trevor McFur was. Now, this game was developed around the 1991 to 93 era, released in November 1993 as mentioned. It had quite a bit of competition out there, and again, it was a poor start to helping interest the public into the Jaguar. Now, it is a shoot-'em-up, but with a strange premise where you have this entity named Audit that's taken over the galaxy and transformed everyone into an odd creature. You're the galaxy's only hope, naturally, and you're tasked with assaulting the 4 moons surrounding Audit's homeworld before attacking the planet itself. So, in terms of the pros, for the time it looked good, mainly thanks to handling high-color graphics, which featured a blend of hand-drawn, pre-rendered, and digitized objects. The game shows that the Jaguar could handle a solid amount of objects on the screen without slowing down, which was a part of the point. I mean, the Jaguar was designed primarily as a 2D machine, not a 3D one, so 2D's where it could shine. That said, it's far from perfect on the visuals, which I'll get into shortly. The game also lets you select which stage you want to start with, which is unusual among shoot-'em-ups, or at least uncommon at the time. Every moon is split into 3 segments, where you have a space level, the moon level, and then a bonus stage. The space stages were attempting to blend 2 games that had done well for Atari into one, Asteroids and Gates of Zendikon for the Lynx. What this means is that you shoot a lot of asteroids, which split into smaller ones, in addition to other enemies until you reach a boss. Planet-side combat is straightforward shoot-'em-up fare that ends in a lengthy boss battle, while the boss rounds consist of flying through colorized hoops. With the Jag using a keypad, the designers thought it fitting, if not necessary, to make use of it by assigning each of the special weapons you could collect to one of the keys. This means that the game does have some unique weapons which can help with some of the chaos. But that's about where the positives end, and which is also why, with a proper remaster, I think you could fix many of the negatives and turn it into a good game. So let's start with graphics, since the visuals tend to be the first thing that everybody notices in a video game. This being one of the JAG's first games means that much more could have been done. Now, to be fair, it was a launch title, it was a first-generation effort, and so it may not be wholly fair to compare it to, say, Defender 2000, which came out at the end of the Jaguar's lifespan and could be considered a second or maybe even a third-generation developed game. But you also have demos like Native that prove that there was much more that could be done. And it's kind of weird to read old reviews of this, such as when GamePro claimed that Trevor McFur was a great example of texture mapping, when this game had nothing to do with that. I think they meant pre-rendered sprites. But as mentioned, Trevor McFur blends 3 types of arts into one, which apart from the uneven art direction makes it feel inconsistent. There are stages like this one where I have no clue what they were thinking for this, but there it is. Maybe this is what GamePro was thinking? I don't know. While these backgrounds, for the most part, look nice and colorful at a glance, you'll notice on a modern display, especially, how much compression artifacting there is. Such artifacts are often the bane of my professional existence with some side work that I do, but it's really weird to go back to a game and see such prevalent artifacting taking place. Other Jag games don't suffer from this, so I think it had to do with an early compression algorithm that they were using, but it screams like it was something to be fixed. The other thing that's always been strange about this game, and something that makes it feel more tech demo-y, is how flat the backgrounds look. Now, even when there is a minimal amount of parallax used on the moon stages, it's strikingly bad, but it's worse on the space levels. It doesn't help that it uses a quick repeating scroll image to scroll for the background. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I recall reading that the Jaguar was supposed to be able to handle up to 15 layers of parallax. Whether it's less or more isn't so much the point. We have various examples of extensive parallax scrolling on titles like the aforementioned Defender 2000 or even Kasumi Ninja, which show that the system could do it just fine in this regard, so a remaster would really need at least a few on the space levels, on the moon levels, just anything to make it look more than you're just flying up against a flat image. Like, there's just no sense of depth. Again, even when there is a little bit of parallax scrolling on the moon stages, it just still everything feels so flat. And on the space stages, I'm surprised they didn't use something like, say, stars, scrolling parallaxed stars, kind of like you get in some games of the era or the 80s. There's also a matter of frame animations. BJ West, who was one of the game's animators, once stated on the now-defunct Jaguar Sector 2 forums that he had rendered over 20 frames of animation for the Mud Boss character. Then he was told by some higher-up that the project had to ditch most of those frames for the final product. Yes, this would mean a bigger cart and shoving more frames into everything, but that's what they're doing for Towers 2. It was originally a 2 megabyte game, now it's going to be a 4 megabyte game, so I would say why not do that for Trevor McFur, if not up to 6. Of course, the costs of that are pretty high, unfortunately, but still, you could get away with cramming more in, maybe even more stages. As for other special effects, I'm sure more could be done, be it particle effects or cry lighting effects and sprite scaling. Yeah, there's a little bit of sprite scaling on the title screen, but that's it. I mean, when you look at almost any Lynx game, they were pushing sprite scaling hard, almost on every single title, even if it didn't really make sense to do so. And so it's weird to see it practically non-existent in this particular game. The game does attempt to have a story with these bad photoshops of a lion or cat's head on a person. If you really had to keep those, at least spruce it up with some text effects like dynamic gradient shading or particles or an animated background or something, I think it'd be better to ditch all that and replace these with some new cutscenes. Now, moving on from the looks, how about how it plays? There are quite a few big issues that would need to be fixed here. As mentioned, the moon each stage is split into 3. The space level, where you get randomly generated asteroids that break apart when shot, along with a bunch of enemies flying or shooting at you. The moon, where you're just fighting weird enemies who sometimes have their patterns. Sometimes there are ground targets. Mostly they're flying and shooting at you, and on a couple of these stages you got to watch out for the terrain. And then there's the bonus stage. Now, that in 1993, you had other shoot-'em-ups like Batsugun by Toaplan, Lords of Thunder, Rayforce, Raiden 2, and many others. While Trevor McFur was in development, the dev staff should have had access to other games released in that time. I'll use Sega's Aeroflash and Hudson's Gates of Thunder as some examples. Judging Trevor McFur against any of these shows how much polish it really needed to get close to their glory. So the first issue is length. Don't have long levels unless you can keep them engaging and fresh. If you pay close attention to the arcade shooters like Batsugan or Raiden, you'll notice that the stages usually don't last terribly long, maybe 1.5 to 2 minutes at most, and that's because in an arcade environment you need to keep people engaged, and so that's where they do a very, very good job at them. With a lot of console shoot-em-ups, though, that aren't arcade ports, they do tend to be longer, and Trevor McFur falls into this trap. But the issue is that, again, if you are not really engaging the player in interesting ways throughout these, say, 5-minute long levels, which is about the length of the Trevor McFur stages, then it gets dull because you're asking yourself, when is this level going to be over? Because it's just kind of the same thing over and over and over and over again. This is one reason why mid-level bosses generally pop up, because they help break that monotony, or you have different things happening with the environments. Gates of Thunder is an excellent example of how the environment is constantly changing, and that keeps you engaged because you don't know what's coming next. Whereas in Trevor McFur, it's just, oh look, another asteroid. Oh look, another asteroid. Another asteroid. Oh, some enemies now that are doing the same thing that the enemies did before, with more asteroids. And it's just pretty boring. And I would also redesign the hitbox. Now, Japanese shoot-em-ups generally put the only collidable pixels on the player ship in a small box, either the cockpit or the center of the craft, and not the entire thing. With Trevor McFur's ship, it looks alright as far as the design goes. I would maybe make those wings a little bit shorter, but it's kind of huge, and it feels cheap with the one-hit kills on your not-so-maneuverable starfighter, particularly on the cave level where it's easy to run into those spikes. I'd also definitely redesign Cutter's support ship because it's clunky and cringe at the same time. Now, how would I go about redesigning the levels? So let's start with the space one, since that's where you start off. I get what they were trying to do with the asteroids idea, but with how it's implemented, it just doesn't work. Now, yes, it does randomize things at least, but with that, you have to be careful. A lot of times, shoot-'em-up fans appreciate repetitive patterns because you know what to expect, and that makes it easier to learn everything about the game and then one CC it or one credit clear it. And so, while you can do some randomization, the problem with Trevor McFur's is just too much. And there's just too much chaos that's going on when you have these asteroids coming along with the enemies. And so the asteroids, in my opinion, should have been spaced out. It shouldn't be constantly happening. And so you just have a few instances where they pop up, and this could be one way of freshening things up. Like you have an asteroids portion, and then you have an enemies portion, and then asteroids again, and then enemies again, and then maybe you mix up the two when you're near the end. But not just this constant thing that's going non-stop the entire time. But there's also another way that I've often thought about how Trevor McFur could work in this regard, and this would require a lot of work, a lot of changes, as it might also be more interesting to have the space levels play like they were Defender, so that would allow you to scroll right or left, and you could still have the asteroids coming out, but you would instead, in my view, what would make sense is that the asteroids are being shot from the moon's surface, kind of like Starship Troopers, where the bugs used asteroids as their interstellar weapon. And so you could say Audit was essentially doing that, sending asteroids out into space. And so as Trevor McFur, you need to stop these asteroids from getting past the top of the screen, which is your range or something. And so in a Defender-like setting, you would have an asteroids counter, and you need to try and eliminate all the asteroids that you can, and so once it reaches a certain limit, then you clear the stage. But more asteroids that pass the upper echelon limit, the harder the stage would be. So the more you clear, the easier it would be. And this is kind of a concept that was used with Planet Smashers on the Atari 7800. Just kind of in reverse, and again with the Defender idea. But I think that would be fun. Granted, it's hard to say. You would need to play test that out, and of course you could spice some enemies here and there in it as well, kind of like Defender again, but you're not having to worry about humanoids and all that. But that would be a way, to me, that would really have made Trevor McFur stand out and be unique. For the lunar assaults, I'd have your ship coming in, burning, like from atmospheric re-entry, and then gradually ramp up the action on the enemies you face. And it would make most sense to front load the levels with some ground targets and a few flying enemies, and then ramping up the flying enemies with different patterns while pulling back on the ground targets as you get further in. And of course, have some mid-range bosses, or mid-level bosses, sorry, that could help break any monotony there, or you could have even obstacles. I also think that having missions would be interesting, such as destroy 15 ground targets, or don't get hit, or take out 3 enemy defense turrets. I guess maybe that's missions or achievements, and that could also be applied to the mid-level bosses, which would make more sense to do here than in the space side of the levels, regardless of which if you went the defender direction or just the more focused and polished design of the space levels. Now, Gates of Thunder on the TurboGrafx 16 is a great example of landscapes being just as much your enemy as the flying robots are. I would think it would be awesome to kind of borrow this idea for Trevor McFur, since the main villain is some kind of all-powerful entity. It makes sense in universe to have him manipulating the environments against you. Of course, when this happens, you have to pull back on the enemies so that the player can focus on the environmental dangers, but add that in with some voiceovers from Audit taunting the player, and it would make for a more compelling game. I also like the idea of destructible walls that you have to shoot through, kind of like in a Magic's laser gates. And there have been some other shoot-'em-ups that have done that before. You wouldn't need to have it happen all the time, but used sparingly, it could keep things interesting without having to decrease the time in the level. Now, each level, of course, would need some redesign work done to it. The cave level is interesting, but how the spikes are laid out just needs to be more like Super Cobra, and less like putting you as a fish in a barrel, because that's how I feel anytime I play it, where it's like I'm just restricted to this very small area in the center of the screen. There's so many spikes, and they don't let up, and there's falling spikes, that it just makes it more frustrating than fun. The dynamic level changes would probably shine best in this regard. I'd also redesign the Goofy Moon. I don't know what to call that one. I had even forgot that it even existed until I did this recording, and even back in the 90s when I first played this game, I thought it kind of bizarre, and it's definitely my least favorite level in the game. The look makes just no sense, and it's like you're playing through some 90s kid's toy box, not like you're invading a moon. And also the barriers were just far too big. I mean, if you want to keep the pastel colors, fine. Just change the setting to make it look like you're flying through some ruins of an advanced civilization that never left 1991's fashion or something sci-fi. The player should feel like they're flying on an alien moon, not into someone's drug-induced fantasy. Now, the boss fights could also use some pattern makeovers. Nintendo, of course, has mastered this idea, but so have many other Japanese game developers when it comes to shoot-'em-ups and having bullet patterns. I'm not saying that it would have to be like a bullet hell shooter necessarily. Sometimes I don't really like that, because if I'm just spending all my time dodging, it's not really fun to me. So I kind of like where Raiden found a nice medium within there, where there's plenty of bullets on the screen, but not just like filling the screen with them completely. And of course, you would want to keep it within the Jaguar's abilities. You don't want it to slow down to a super crawl or anything. But either way, bullet patterns I think should change when the boss is at, say, 2/3 health, and then 1/3 health, obviously becoming a little more difficult as you get closer to blowing it up. Now, would I change much about the bonus rounds? Well, they're not a big deal, although I think it'd be a nice nod to the homebrew game Flappy McFur to do something like that instead of just flying through hoops. I mean, you wouldn't have to turn into a catbird or have your starfighter flap its wings, although I guess that would work within the universe of Audit. But instead, maybe have your retro rockets fire on your ship so that when the button's pressed, it makes it feel like Flappy Bird, so that you have to navigate through the hoops that way. And, of course, change the stupid background. Now, again, all of this would likely require at least a 4MB cartridge or the Jaguar GD, the game drive. I'd love to see more stuff come out on that in an SD card format, and then we could probably do 6 MB a lot easier. And to that end, I would say, as long as you got more space to work with, add more to the backgrounds, add more of the parallax as mentioned, restore the old boss animations, as well as some of the enemies, give them a little bit more, maybe throw in some more enemies too, like the mid-level bosses. And if you could get any of the boss animations up into the 20s or higher as originally intended, then to me that's what should be done. Now, of course, last but certainly not least is something you probably figured I'd start with, but I'm subverting expectations and keeping the biggest glaring issue for last: music. Atari mentioned in an early promo that this game took full advantage of the Jaguar CD quality stereo sound and that it featured a cosmic soundtrack. Now, maybe there's a lost version of this game that had a complete soundtrack. What was released and what people were charged $50 for does not have almost anything. You have some doinky track at the title screen and the planet selection screen, and that's it. Otherwise, in level, you've got nothing more than pops and shoos and booms. The lack of in-game music and very limited effects get someone's nerves rather quickly, and just the presence of a decent soundtrack with different songs, given the Jaguar's later history of having excellent techno soundtracks, such as heard in Tempest 2000, Defender 2000, Battlemore of 05, I think that would fit pretty well with Trevor McFur. Of course, I do think that having a synth track with some of the asteroids' heartbeat thumping going on, like on the Atari 2600 version or even the arcade version, would be icing on the cake for the space levels. That either way, it needs music. That if you changed nothing else about Trevor McFur, just threw in music about it, that would automatically raise it from like a D+ to a C, maybe a C+, depending on the quality of the music. Of course, it still would have all these other issues of the gameplay there, but with music, it makes it more of an enjoyable overall experience. So that's it. That's how I would redesign, remaster Trevor McFur. No, I'm not any good at computer programming. I can do artwork and some sound stuff, but unfortunately, this is one of those, I guess, port begging style sort of things out there of somebody who should do this and spend all the time and effort on doing this. Of course, I would be more than happy to contribute to any sort of remaster as I could here, but yeah, well, I don't expect this to ever really happen, just throwing out how I would do it. But are there any other Jaguar games that you would like to see remade, remastered, and what would you change about them? Do you agree with the changes that I would make to Trevor McFur, or you wholeheartedly disagree? Should it stay the same and stay sucking for eternity? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.